The cell body on the neuron is this large portion right here that we're highlighting. And attached onto the cell body, we see multiple dendrites. So these smaller branches, any of these would be the dendrites all around the cell body. We have the term, the axon hillock is where it tapers down. So this section here. And then the long, slender portion is the axon. Going back to a term I skipped over, you see the axon then branches, and the very ends, one name for it is synaptic terminals. It's a common term used there, or terminal boutons is also listed in the lab manual. So now we need to go back to this view here, because now this is showing an axon that truly is myelinated, that's wrapped. And what we're able to see here is, well, first of all, it's these yellow cells illustrated. These are the Schwann cells that you see just wrap right around the axon. And in fact, when a Schwann cell wraps around several times, the layers that are now made, that's the term a myelin sheath, or just simply the myelin. So it comes from the several layers of the Schwann cell being wrapped around the axon. It's the myelin sheath. And then lastly, we don't see it here. Wrapped around the Schwann cell would be the endoneurium. So to actually see that, let's go to the model. So here's the model of the nerve cell, the actual model we would use. And just going through the list again. So there's the cell body portion. I'll just put CV, the cell body portion. The dendrites are the branches coming off here, either the white portion or the clear portion. And let's just zoom in a little closer. So this number 14 over here, or the clear part, doesn't matter if it's this whitish portion or the clear part. These are the dendrites. The terminal boutons, or synaptic terminals, they're shown here in tan. So any of these here, the number 5. So any of these tan parts here. And the idea is these are terminal boutons or synaptic terminals from another nerve cell. So imagine there's another nerve cell out here. It has its axon, and then its axon comes down to make that terminal bouton. If we go back here, the axon is just simply this long, slender portion of the nerve cells, the axon. The axon hillock is right here where it's tapering down. So AH, the axon hillock, this area that's just kind of tapering down, and then it leads to the axon itself. The myelin sheath, we can now see that here in this gray color. Oh, said that wrong. Myelin sheath, the yellow cell represented here is the Schwann cell. The entire yellow cell is the Schwann cell. The myelin sheath, again, is the layering made by the Schwann cell. So as it wraps around several layers, is the myelin sheath. The endoneurium, that's right here, the gray layer. So the endoneurium is this layer of tissue, you notice, that's wrapped around all of the layers of the myelin sheath and the Schwann cell. Okay, so there it is, correctly labeled. And just a closer look again, the cell body, the dendrite, the synaptic terminals, axon hillock leading to the axon. We don't need this view necessarily, just a better look at the axon hillock. All right, so that'll move us along from this first section. And then we're moving in now to the brain. So this part 1 here, We're just going to use some images only for this part one. And I'll go ahead and bring up these meninges pictures. So it's going to start with the three major layers: dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. And this is kind of a cool image here. So we notice that we are looking at, well, the scalp, the skin, getting into the muscles, getting down to the actual bone. And on the deep side of the bone, inside the cranial bones, this first layer of tissue is dura mater. The second major layer, arachnoid mater. And then the third layer, right on the brain at this point, is called pia mater. So it's those three principal layers to start with the meninges. But now let's fill in some of the details. So specific to the dura mater, we have these three details here. And we need to move to this next image here. So again, all of this meninges, everything on part one is going to come from just from these textbook images. So the falx cerebri is this specific piece of tissue right here. It's right in the medial part, right in the midline of the brain. It actually separates the two halves of the brain. The tentorium cerebelli, that's now this horizontal portion right here. And this also runs into the midsection of the brain with this horizontal orientation. And the last one we want from this view is the falx cerebelli. Is now this final inferior piece right down here. So these three specific pieces, but they're all details from the dura mater, all three of these. So now going back to the arachnoid mater, the middle layer, but now specifically it has this deeper section called a subarachnoid space. So we have this view to show that detail. And you notice we're looking in chapter 16 for these images, all of these meninges. So to start at the beginning, the superficial layer first, the dura mater. The second layer, the arachnoid mater. But now the area here that really looks like a web, that's where the name arachnoid comes from. This area specifically right in here is called subarachnoid space, kind of all this web-like layering. And then lastly, this very, very thin, delicate layer touching right on the brain is the pia mater. So we'll need these few images here for any of this dura mater portion, and this is all in the brain chapter 16. All right, so we have, again, all of this tan area is the telencephalon at the top of the brain. If we go to this view, we can see the two halves, the two cerebral hemispheres. We would have to take it apart to see a view of the gray matter and white matter. We are looking right at the cerebral cortex because that's just the surface of the telencephalon. The gyri are the bumps. So anywhere you see the bumps are the gyri, and any of the tight grooves are the sulci. So all around. This number 5, that's probably a little too blurry, but specifically right here, that is the central sulcus coming across here. So that's central sulcus. So making this bump the pre-central gyrus, and then the one behind it, the post-central gyrus. Post-central gyrus. Let's go back to a view here. So we have a frontal lobe of the brain, a temporal lobe of the brain, a parietal lobe of the brain, and at the back, an occipital lobe of the brain. We unfortunately don't have a view internally to see the insula. the longitudinal fissure, the split right down the middle, and the transverse fissure, again, inferior to the occipital lobe. And we now know this is the cerebellum. And it's just between those two is the transverse fissure. The lateral sulcus. Okay, so we have the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and splitting those is a lateral sulcus. We have to split the model in half, and the number 10 right here, all the number 10s, that's the corpus callosum. The septum pellucidum is the area right here. It's a septum pellucidum. The lateral ventricles, choroid plexus, interventricular foramen. Of course, we have to go back to this model for that detail. Lateral ventricle, interventricular foramen, and the pink areas everywhere, choroid plexus. So that's the telencephalon. We'll do the same on the model with the diencephalon. So that could be the view here. So the area of the diencephalon, again, as a whole, we're looking all in this area right here. This is the whole diencephalon circled. And specifically, to get to the details, this oval shape is the thalamus. We're just going right in order, thalamus. The intermediate mass is this dark dot here. Intermediate mass. Hypothalamus is now this lower section right here, is the hypothalamus. The pineal gland, we're just looking right here at this number 23, is the pineal gland, or it could be said pineal body, either way. So pineal gland or pineal body is fine. The third ventricle, we would have to go back to the gray and pink model. Choroid plexus again on that same model, so that would take us right back to this view. Third ventricle and the pink areas again, we said it a bunch of times, choroid plexus. Continuing with the diencephalon, a mammillary body is this number 24 right here, is a mammillary body. And since we're here, we'll skip to the pituitary gland, that's this big bulb. So hanging off of the hypothalamus, hanging down, the big bulb here is the pituitary gland. And then we have to go to this view. We could again see these two optic nerves, but more importantly, where they meet in the center, is that optic chiasm. So that's our list for the diencephalon. We need to go to this view here for mesencephalon. And let's just see where we are on the list. So the mesencephalon region of the brain. And the various items we have here for the mesencephalon. So you can see this narrow, again, mesencephalic aqueduct or aqueduct in midbrain is that narrow canal. All of this area posterior to it, all of that area is the corpora quadragemina. And then specifically there's the two bumps. So the top bump is a superior colliculus, and the lower bump, inferior colliculus. And that's all of the mesencephalon that we need. We'll then just change colors and go on to the metencephalon. So the metencephalon has a pons, so this big bump here. And again, here we are seeing half of a cerebellum. And in particular, this is called a cerebellar hemisphere, just half of a cerebellum. And the white lines, specifically the white lines, that is the arbor vitae. So the deeper white lines, the white matter of the cerebellum. So we could back out of that. And just a quick look. Here you can see the entire cerebellum, this brown color. And of course, the two halves are the hemispheres. All right, so almost done. The inferior part of the brain, the last portion, the myelencephalon with the medulla oblongata, and then once again, more ventricles. So let's just bring that over here to get it ready. So the inferior part of the brain, here's that area for the entire myelencephalon, and just the two areas. There is the medulla oblongata, and then we have the space in here. This is the space of the fourth ventricle. And again, we have a model that shows all of the ventricles. So that puts us down here once more, the fourth ventricle. And again, the pink areas always on this model is a choroid plexus. There are 4 ventricles. There are 4 choroid plexuses. And that will finish up this section on the brain. We're looking at the function of cranial nerves. So there's 12 pairs. That's the classical naming system. 12 pairs of cranial nerves that branch in and out of the brain. And for this section, we'll go ahead and open up our Canvas page. And we have this file right here, and everything is spelled out for us already. So to begin, we have the numbering system for the cranial nerves. And you notice just scrolling down, there's the 12 pairs, and pairs meaning right and left, of course. For our purposes now, the numbers will not be important at all, so you don't have to worry about the number column. The way to name them properly is with Roman numerals, but again, don't worry about the number column. So we have the name of the cranial nerves, and then we have a mnemonic. The old owls on treetops are forever viewing green valleys and hills. So that was just a good mnemonic that I was used to for learning the names of the cranial nerves. And again, the charts filled in. We have the last column here. So this is looking at the detailed function for each nerve. So when it comes to cranial nerves, some of the cranial nerves only carry sensory information, afferent information. Some of the cranial nerves only carry motor or efferent information. And a few of the cranial nerves are mixed, meaning one cranial nerve carries both sensory and motor function in the same nerve. So of course, you got to remember sensory signals travel towards the brain, motor signals traveling away. That's always the case. And some of them have a mixed function, meaning some axons run towards the brain and some axons carry motor signal away from the brain. So to help you with this simple description, is the nerve sensory, motor, or is it both sensory and motor in one nerve? That's the mnemonic here. Some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter most. So if it starts with an S, obviously, that's a sensory only nerve. Starting with an M, It's a motor only nerve. And when it starts with a B, that would imply that it's both sensory and motor. The correct term would be mixed, a mixed nerve, but the mnemonic, of course, is really helpful. So all the information is here on the chart for each nerve. But to help you visualize this, we'll go back to the chapter and we'll go through each one. So the table truly has everything you need. And this is just an illustration, just showing the nerves on the brain. We're not concerned with this image for lecture, but you can see the names of the nerves. And again, the mnemonic for the names right here. So now just going through the chart in terms of, we're concerned with the name of the nerve and the details of its function. And these figures here are helpful because we see the innervation of the nerve. We see where that nerve connects to. So the first one, the olfactory nerve, well, the term olfaction, that means our sense of smell. And we can see the nasal cavity as we breathe in, and chemicals that we happen to breathe in are now detected by receptors right there in the nasal cavity. And it makes sense. We use our nose for our sense of smell. And again, smell is a sensation. So we're seeing the first cranial nerve, the paired olfactory nerves. It's a sensory only nerve, and it's our sense of smell. Right? You use your nose to smell. So number 2 is where we get to the optic nerve. So optics, vision, sight. And you can see here, this is another sensory only nerve. That's of course what sight or vision is, a sensation. And again, we can see that connection specifically to the retina of the eye. So where we're detecting light, and then we send that information for visual sensation into the brain. So number 2, optic nerve, beginning from the retina, the receptors in our retina, and our eyes, of course, used for vision. So as we get to the third cranial nerve, and again, the mnemonic could help, old owls on. Number 3 starts with an O. The function mnemonic, some say money matters. So the third one, some say money, it starts with an M. Our third cranial nerve, it's got to start with the letter O, and it's a motor nerve. And there we see oculomotor, and a motor only nerve. So again, just reminding you of the mnemonic. So here we can see the term oculomotor is a big hint, something to do with the eye and motor function. And we just previously learned, of course, the various skeletal muscles that rotate the eye in the socket. And again, the illustration is nice. You could just follow the figure and you can see how it leads to particular skeletal muscles of the eye. So we don't have to be specific with naming the exact muscles, but we see the function here is the oculomotor nerve. It signals to both skeletal muscle surrounding the eye, as well as internal smooth muscle of the eye. And a great example would be the iris. So it's both skeletal and smooth muscle that's inside of the eye, and the external skeletal muscle that rotates the eye. So that's the function of oculomotor nerve. And keep in mind, one eye has 6 different muscles. Remember the 4 rectus muscles, the 2 obliques. The oculomotor only controls just a few of those skeletal muscles. So that'll lead us to number 4, the trochlear nerve, and you notice the same image, and it has the same similar function, but however, it's only controlling skeletal muscle of the eye. And again, you could use the little figure to follow. We don't have to be specific and name which exact skeletal muscle, but it's important to note that the trochlear nerve only controls just skeletal muscle surrounding the eye. Number 5 also starts with the letter T, right? Old owls on tree tops. So we're at the trigeminal nerve, number 5. And the name itself is kind of a hint. The 3 branches, you can see here. And this is now an example of a mixed nerve. It has both sensory and motor function. So looking at the name tri and the 3 branches, that's now coming from the 3 major branches for the sensory function. So any general sensations, pressure, pain, sensations, the general sensations from your face, eyes, and mouth. And you can see the 3 branches that would carry that sensory information in towards the brain. And the motor function, this controls muscles for elevating the mandible, for biting, for chewing. So here's our first example of a mixed dual purpose sensory and motor function in one cranial nerve. And then now moving on to cranial nerve number 6, the abducens nerve. We're once again looking at motor function only. And again, here it is, skeletal muscle surrounding the eye. So again, as we mentioned, the eye has 6 different skeletal muscles. And at this point, we saw there's now 3 different nerves to control those various skeletal muscles. So it'll be nice just to go back to review that. Oculomotor. Oculomotor controls some of the skeletal muscles. There's the trochlear and the abducens. The key differences, though, oculomotor, as we pointed out, this controls both skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. So that's what makes the oculomotor nerves function unique. So let's get back to where we were. After number 6, abducens, that'll lead us to number 7, the facial nerve. So here's another example of a mixed cranial nerve, sensory and motor function. And again, these illustrations are helpful in learning that. Description, you can see where the nerves connect to for the most part. So the sensory function for the facial nerve, this now signals from the taste buds on the anterior portion of our tongue. So any taste sensation from the anterior portion, which is key, that taste information is now signaled through the facial nerve, whereas the motor function, and this is where the illustration is helpful and the name is very clear, the facial nerve, this helps, of course, to stimulate muscles for facial expressions, and we learned a few of those in the previous unit. And here's the first time we're going to see now this motor function for salivary glands. We have various sets of salivary glands, and we'll see this come up a few times. So it's both a sensory sensation from the anterior portion of the tongue and motor control for muscles of facial expression, as well as stimulating activity of the salivary glands. So number 8 is going to bring us to the vestibulocochlear nerve, and the name right here is also quite descriptive. So vestibulo, this is now the portion involved in equilibrium. So our sensation, our perception of our location and gravity, and that's important for balance. And then the cochlea, the spiraling cochlea of the inner ear, of course, used for auditory function, for hearing. So these are 2 sensations, auditory, our ability to hear sound, and equilibrium sensation is truly our placement in gravity, the awareness of our placement in gravity. So putting those 2 together, vestibulocochlear nerve, hearing and equilibrium sensations for cranial nerve number 8. And what we're looking at here is, I'll just point out for reference, right here we see the eardrum, and we're looking at the inner ear at this point. In fact, you may recall some of this terminology. internal acoustic meatus, we're looking at the temporal bone of the cranium. So then moving along to number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. So we're now looking at the area, the back of the throat, the pharynx, of course, spanning down the throat, back of the mouth and throat is that glossopharyngeal nerve. And this is another mixed nerve, dual purpose, sensory and motor. So whereas the facial nerve number 7, detects taste sensation from the anterior portion of the tongue, glossopharyngeal is now detecting taste sensations from the posterior taste buds on the tongue. And the motor function, again, it fits in line with the glottis and the pharyngeal, the back of the mouth and throat. So control of muscles for swallowing, and we'll actually see this description for the next few muscles. There's several muscles involved in the process of swallowing. And here we are, we can actually see again more of the salivary glands that are going to be stimulated. So the production of saliva stimulating those glands, as well as muscles and the pharynx for proper swallowing. And that leads us into number 10, the vagus nerve. So this is a cranial nerve of the brain. You can see the medulla oblongata there, the very inferior brainstem. This is another example of a mixed sensory and motor nerve. So this is a cranial nerve. However, you notice with the illustration, this is the cranial nerve that now branches all throughout the torso. So its purpose, really generalized here for our purposes, the sensory function is, of course, carrying sensory sensations from the organs of the torso. So pressure, pain, stimulation in the organs of the torso. And the motor function you see is sending motor commands to organs of the torso. And we're once again seeing in the area of the throat a motor function to now control muscles involved in the swallowing process. So such as we're swallowing food. So that mixed nerve. And just the term vagus, the word vagus means to wander. And this is a cranial nerve that's branching or wandering all throughout the torso. So now moving on near the end, number 11, we have what's called the accessory nerve. And this is now another nerve, you notice, branching from that inferior brainstem. And the accessory nerve, this is another one that now travels, you notice, in this case, down the neck into the shoulder regions. So we can see, you notice the trapezius muscle, the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and that's part of its motor function. So now we're seeing nerves that only have a motor function. So that's that efferent motor signaling from this accessory nerve. And here's the last time, the third time now we're seeing muscles involved in swallowing here in the throat. And the importance of this is the food that we swallow, we want it to go to our pharynx and to our esophagus, to our digestive system, as opposed to having anything clog our airway. So we have an intricate function of muscles to make sure that we don't choke. So here's the last time we're seeing muscles for swallowing. And then as I just pointed out, the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius muscles. So muscles, of course, that act upon the area of the neck and shoulders. And again, the figures are nice to really illustrate that. So that'll bring us to the final one, number 12, is hypoglossal nerve. And the hypoglossal nerve, this is the last one, 12th cranial nerve. So again, only a motor function. And we can see it right here. That's signaling, of course, to the muscle of the tongue. So for muscular control and movement of the tongue. Higher image, and specifically the neuron cell body is this larger portion here with the blue tint to it. whereas the second term, the neuroglia, are any of these small little dots. So that's the neuroglia, and we could zoom in. So once again, that detail of the cell body is this larger portion of the cell here, the cell body. It's a portion of the neuron that contains the nucleus, and then these smaller little dots, and you see they're scattered around. These are those supporting neuroglial cells.